Building Science 101 is sponsored by Anderson Windows and Doors, Builders FirstSource, Huber Engineered Woods, Polyguard, Sashco, and Derail.
All right, my friends, Building Science 101. The next module we're talking about here is vapor and vapor control. Steve, why don't you start us off? How do we even define vapor?
Well, it's funny because it's somewhat, we talked about water management, and then we talked about air tightness being a little more elusive. Vapor management is an illusionary tactic by the building science world to make us scared as hell of something.
Yeah, it's true.
No matter what I do, whatever detail I show, where's your vapor barrier? Where's your vapor barrier? Like, vapor to the building industry is this big, bad monster.
Yeah.
Right? That's coming to kill my building.
Yeah.
And I have to, be prepared because that big old monster's coming to get me. But, going back to Joe would always say, moisture's in all the air around us at some level.
Yep.
Some places drier, some places wetter. But the reality is it's all around us. And he would always say, who the hell cares about vapor? Vapor is never a problem. Condensation is an issue.
Right.
But vapor is not a problem.
Yeah.
Go to Louisiana on the 4th of July, New Orleans. Like, you'll sweat to all get out.
Yeah.
But it's not a problem until it condenses on that surface and becomes liquid water. In the vapor state, it's just, a bunch of molecules in there that as the temperature warms, those molecules move a little bit faster. And because of that energy, it can hold moisture a little better than the lazy cold air.
Yeah, that's right.
Where those molecules are barely moving. But it's, kind of synonymous with our bodies. If I'm laying around on the couch, I'm probably not sweating nearly as much as if I get up off the couch and I go out and play basketball. That energy, it brings out that vapor.
Yeah, so if we've got warm air, we can hold more vapor. And when we talk about relative humidity, that's how we measure vapor in the air, right? So if I had my temperature and humidity sensor on the table here, it would say that the air in this office space where I am is probably 70-ish degrees and 50% relative humidity. That humidity percentage is relative to the temperature. If I'm outside in New Orleans, like Steve's example, and it's 90 degrees and 90% humidity, it feels humid. There's a lot of moisture locked up in that hot air. On the other hand, cold air, the molecules are moving slowly in that cold air. Even though the relative humidity might be higher, there's less absolute moisture in the air that's able to be held in cold temperatures. So if it's 30 degrees outside and 50% relative humidity, the grains of moisture in that air are much, much smaller than the grains of moisture in that air that's 90 degrees and 90% humidity.
Yeah, and just being that big old bad monster just makes it like it's a criminal to the building industry. But it really isn't.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, one of the things that I like to lecture on is the myth of vapor. Because again, everybody thinks of it as a liability to my buildings. Oh, I can't let moisture in there. I can't let moisture in there. But we talked earlier about building science and things having the ability to dry. Well, what do you think the mechanism is for a building to dry? Well, they're the same mechanisms that allow a building to get wet.
Yeah.
Right? So vapor is really, it can be a liability, but it's also an asset. Because when things get wet, I need that vapor movement to dry things out.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? So I have to build assemblies with the knowledge of, hey, I don't want it to get wet. So I'm trying to manage that vapor movement across my wall. But should things get wet, just like water management, should things get in, I got to provide a path to get out. Well, the same with vapor management, that should moisture get into my wall system, how do I let it out?
Yeah.
And how do I get rid of it? So it's not that, big old bad monster all the time. And that's where, here we talk about it being an asset versus a liability. And that's one of our concepts for vapor management.
So it's perspective, right?
It's all about perspective. And for whatever reason, which I can't wrap my hands around just yet, the building industry wraps their arms around it being a liability, but they don't. I mean, the people that really understand it, you talk to Joe or you talk to a John Straub or Coda, they're gonna talk about drying potential and all of these issues because they obviously thoroughly understand the concept. But for your average architect, builder, client, person, they get in like vapor's bad. And we need to stop thinking about it being bad because it has the potential to be bad, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, good point.
Let's stop thinking about that. The second concept here is the load upon which vapor hits our building. Now, if you're talking about structural loads, there's two types. There's a point load where me standing on the middle of a floor joist, I exert a specific amount of weight that is a point load on that beam. But if I lay down across that beam, it's still somewhat of a point load, but I've expanded that load across a larger surface area and created more of a uniformed load. And that's what moisture is, right? Moisture is a uniformed load. It never attacks our buildings on the inside. If we have high humidity in our house, it doesn't focus on, 1 square foot of floor area or one square foot of wall area. It doesn't have the capacity to maintain that level of focus as a point load. It hits all of our surfaces in a nice uniform load. So that means that our assembly, unlike say air leakage where I'm concentrating on a specific transition point, when it comes in terms of moisture, I have to deal with it as this kind of all-encompassing load that's attacking whatever my vapor barrier or smart retarder system is.
Yeah, two things I want to add in on that is moisture, just like heat, always moves from more to less. So if you have a high humidity area and a low humidity area, let's say there's more moisture in this air, if these two bodies of air are near each other, it's always going to flow from more to less. It wants to equalize in the space. That's why in general, in your house, if all the air is connected, that humidity level will be relatively the same. Now, you might have some areas like a shower that has a higher humidity for a period of time because you're adding humidity to that space. But over time, that's going to be a uniform load. It's going to uniformly act upon your building. The same is true between inside and outside. If you have materials that are able to move moisture through them, they have a permeance from the outside to the inside. If there's a differential, it's always going to want to move from more to less.
Probably the best example and misnomer in the building industry in terms of vapor management is, and you're going to laugh because the minute I start talking about it, you're going to be, man, that is spot on. We just drywalled a house and we put plaster. Guess what's in that plaster?
A lot of water.
Buckets of water, barrels of water, right? Like they bring a garden hose in the house, fill the barrel, put the plaster in, mix it up, put it all over the barrel. Well, the funny thing about water is it's somewhat like energy. Like it goes into the plaster, goes onto the wall, but it doesn't go away. That moisture is there. So guess what happens? That moisture comes out. So Joe or Julie builder, what do? They go get a nice salamander heater. Well, what do you think that salamander heater does? It burns a fossil fuel and it's dumping a ton of moisture into the room, into an area that you want to dry out.
It's already humid and moist.
It's already humid. So you're contributing to the problem. You're not providing a solution because heating up that air, it just gives it the capacity to hold more moisture.
That's right.
So the moisture of the wall and the moisture of that heater now are the moisture content in that room. And I always tell builders, it's like if you really want to dry the room, crack that window.
Yeah.
Let that 50-degree or 40-degree air in, because it has about 1/3 of the moisture as the air inside the house.
That's right.
And you just made a good point. Moisture always moves from more to less. It's trying to equalize. It's just like temperature, moving from hot to cold, more to less. It is always in constant flux in search of equalization.
Yep.
So opening that window, colder, drier air comes in, warmer, hot air mixes with it, and guess what? You get lukewarm water with a lower moisture content that was in the room.
Yep.
When you open that window.
That's right. I may be out of sequence in asking this, but I'd like for you to talk for a minute about vapor barriers, because that's a term I heard a lot in my younger days as a builder. How would you explain that, and how would you talk about that concept in today's Building Science 101?
So, we'll start at the highest level. The minute I introduce the word barrier, I'm introducing, let's just substitute it. In any sentence you use the word barrier, substitute without exception, right? Vapor transfer without exception.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to say it.
Water transfer without exception, right? So if you're Jim or Julie builder or an architect that thinks you could beat Mother Nature without exception, and that never is a word that's very definitive, right? Never doesn't mean maybe so. It doesn't mean 1 out of 1 billion times. It means never.
Without
exception.
That's good.
So if you think you can build a barrier without exception, be my guest. You'll be the first one to do it that I know. And when you do it, please call me. I want to come take pictures and video, and I'll make you famous, because we'll make it news. But a lot of people call, where's your vapor barrier? Well, let's back off of using that vapor barrier misnomer, Joe would say. And let's really talk about vapor management.
Mm-hmm. That's a great way to say it. Vapor.
We have to manage it, because management says basically dealing with vapor with exception, not without exception.
That's a great way to say it. I like that a lot.
So the whole vapor barrier idea, we could sit here, we could talk for hours on whether or not to use the word barrier, but you know what? I'm going to cut it short. Let's discard it. Let's never say it again.
It's good.
Because it doesn't make sense. Now, what does make sense is a vapor retarder, smart vapor retarder, vapor management. Those are all concepts that you can get behind, right? Because without exception suggests that my wall, whether it's from the inside or the outside, is never going to get wet.
Mm-hmm.
But if it does, with exception, I need the ability to dry out either to the inside or to the outside, depending on how my wall is designed.
Yep.
Right. So I have to, in my design details, I have to provide the management structure that should things get wet, we have a path to get out.
I want to throw a grenade in that real quick, just by saying, I've heard Joe Stiebrick say this many times, and I'm in agreement. If we deal with the other control layers that were of a higher level of importance, which is both water and air, vapor will take care of itself.
Yeah.
This is the both least important and probably least understood of the control layers. And if we do a good job of water management and a good job of air management, vapor is going to kind of take care of itself. With your exception, which I like to put in there, is let's not make barriers. Let's not make that never case scenario. We want to use materials that have some ability for vapor to transfer through them. And often that's referred to in the building science world as permeance, or sometimes perm rating. So when we look at data sheets, let's say for weather resistive barriers, you'll often see a perm rating on that barrier. And I've gotten asked a lot over the years, what perm rating should I use on my WRB? And I think the answer for that is I'd like to not see a 0, but beyond that, it doesn't necessarily matter as long as you've dealt successfully with both water and air. Would you?
I would.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. Now, that brings us into the third concept, though, because if I strike out the B word, I'm not going to say it anymore.
Whenever you say it.
Make me, But if I strike out that B word and I solely buy into the idea of vapor management, then now I have to buy into the idea of it being a rate question, right? If things get wet, and they do, the question is, how do they have the potential to dry? How do I let the water out? Again, that is such a great quote, letting the water out, letting the vapor out. How do I let that out? So it's okay if things get wet, as long as they have the ability to dry. And dry has to be more than wetting on the scale, right? I have to have more drying potential in my system than wetting potential.
Yeah, that's great.
Right?
I've seen Joe Stiebrick make a seesaw before, and the seesaw diagram.
This was my bad example of that.
It's the same. It's the same thing. It's the same scale, but the seesaw example on the scale, if the water dripping into the bucket makes it too heavy for the drying potential, then we're going to have problems. But as long as it's a slow drip in there and we've got plenty of drying potential, then we're fine. It's similar to those old buildings we talked about, the building in the field with the kiln in there.
Yep.
No matter how that water got in, as long as we had plenty of drying potential and frankly plenty of building materials that were able to suck up some of that either liquid water or vapor water, then we had no issues. But if we're using more modern materials, more broken down materials, things like drywall instead of plaster, maybe even man-made studs compared to an original OG stud like this fir 2x6, which is behind you right here. Those things have more potential, the fir stud does, to soak up moisture and to also soak up some of that humidity as well in the house.
I have a real world rate example that I think it is a good example of this. So I investigated a building once that it was, I don't know, like 150, 175-year-old building. From the time that we had gotten the phone call to go and investigate it, they had remodeled it about 3 years earlier, 5 years earlier, something like that. So 150-year-old building that's lasting a very long time. Now someone gets the bright idea, hey, let's remodel it. They go and they insert insulation, they're putting plastic on the walls, and they're doing all this. And they think they're doing something. But what they're really doing is they're messing with the rate equation.
Yeah.
Right? That they're putting less energy into the wall than was there. That 150-year-old building was able to succeed because they just bought a whole lot of energy and it flowed through the wall. So the rate was very high. There was all drying potential. And even you could have put a garden hose against the outside of the wall and it would probably still be fine. There was that much drying potential. But the minute I put insulation in, I'm slowing that rate of energy that moves across my wall. And if I have less energy, then I have less drying potential because I need that heat to help dry. Remember, warmer air, it can take on a little bit more moisture, right? So that colder air becomes a challenge for me. I want to keep things nice and warm, but insulation and energy efficiency and ultimately the code are suggesting that I don't, right? So I have to build an assembly now that understands that rate question. And thankful to us that there's a lot of manufacturers out there that are now making membranes and interior retarder systems that you can put on a wall that they slow the moisture movement into my wall assembly because they know there's no energy inside that wall to deal with it. It's far better to deal with the load in here than it is to deal with the load in there.
That's right.
So I need to stop that uniform load here with a uniform material, which in this case is a giant sheet membrane. But they add the word smart vapor retarder to that. So what they've done is they've basically built a valve in that retarder system that suggests if moisture does get in here, the valve's open and it has the ability to dry back out to the inside.
Yeah.
So it's a one direction drying potential.
That's pretty cool.
Right? So it's excluding it. I won't say the B word, but it's working to slow the moisture migration into that wall system and minimize it. But should it get in there, it's smart enough to open the floodgates to let the moisture back out. So all they're doing is, in that one thin sheet of membrane, they're messing with our drying potential and wetting potential, because they're minimizing the wetting potential, but they're maximizing the drying potential should it get wet.
Yep.
All within that paper thin membrane.
That's right. And in my building career of not quite 30 years, I've been building 27 or so. For many years, we used sheets of plastic for vapor control. And that was, in the end, not a great decision for those houses because it was the B word.
Right.
You can't dry through a Ziploc bag, right? If I pour some water in a Ziploc bag and zip up the top tight, that's not going to dry through the bag. And so we want to avoid things that have zero ability to dry through them. And it's very uncommon these days to see that on a job site, and that's why.
I have no scientific basis for what I'm about to say, but I believe it to be true. When they use poly on the inside of walls, and I actually have pictures of condensation on the backside of poly on walls, because the moisture, once it gets in there, it can't get out.
Yeah.
But the poly, although you were thinking of it as the B word, and that was the sole intention that it got installed, it really worked as an air barrier, not as a vapor.
Interesting. So it did a good job for air.
So it did a good job. So if you watched the episode on air management where I did that diffusion versus the 1-inch square hole, if I allow less moisture, remember, it's a rate question. So if I put 100 cups of water through a hole, I'm getting a ton of water on the backside. Whereas diffusion is 1 cup. But because I blanket my wall with what I considered the vapor barrier, but it's actually the air barrier, I've stopped that escalation process of the air leak. So I think that, the poly, yes, it does work. Moisture can't pass through it. It's damn near impermeable. But the reality is I think it was working more as in a very effective air barrier in saving that wall than the moisture.
Yeah. In general, though, we don't recommend that anymore as a vapor control layer. And in the 201 series that we'll be filming before too long here, we're going to get into some very specific examples and ways that you're going to manage both air and vapor on your jobs.
I'm going to leave you with one last one, because this one really hit home. And it even hurt a little bit, because this is for all you, say, 30 plus builders that know everything. And this is the way I do it. So I had a discussion not too long ago, and the builder wanted to put poly on the ceiling. And I said, why do you want to do that? His answer was, this is how we do it. This is how we do it here, Steve. It might not be from here, but this is how we do it here. I said, okay, but we talk this through. We have a vented roof. The vented roof takes outside air, brings it in, it captures moisture, and then vents out. So I looked at him and said, we're doing a vented attic. He said, yes. I said, do you believe the vented attic works? Of course it does, Steve. We got soffit vents. We got ridge vents there. I said, okay, do you understand the concept behind a vented roof? He kind of started feeling insulted now. It's like, Steve, I've been building for 30 years.
Of course I understand.
Of course I know what the hell a vented roof is. It's to get rid of the moisture accumulation in the building and vent it out.
Yep.
And I said, if you believe all of that to be true, why the hell are you arguing to put a barrier then? The whole purpose of a vented roof is moisture that gets up here, vents out.
Yep.
And he goes out on that airstream. He would not give up.
Interesting.
He would agree that the whole idea and concept behind a vented roof, but he still felt like he had to put a barrier in. And it's like, you know, that's a hard one to overcome because he's not willing to have a discussion.
Yeah.
He actually hung up on me on the call.
Oh my gosh.
And the homeowners actually ended up firing him along the way. But my point is that if you're a builder, even if you're an older builder, and we talked about this earlier, that this is for everybody, the 8th grader and the 30-year-old builder, because it's always good. Even if you think you know everything, let's just check it.
That's right.
And make sure you do know everything.
And let's understand the concepts of why we do things, not just do them without thinking.
Exactly. So that's my stories. That's vapor management. Don't give it a bad rap. It's not the vapor monster you think it is. Right. It has the potential, but like Joe and Matt was just speaking of, if we control it in here and we control things like air leakage, our thermal barrier, and water management,
it's another
vapor is never a problem.
That's right.
This episode of Build Science 101 brought to you by our friends at Sashco. Now, if you're not familiar with this company, this is the maker of Big Stretch, of Lexel, of Slab, of Through the Roof. They've got a whole suite of high performance products that we use all over our projects. How did you come across these guys, Steve?
As an architect, you know, dealing with details and bringing them down to the finest details, especially when you're doing high performance passive homes, you know, the smallest of cracks add up to become very large air leakage numbers. And here we are talking about performance in our 101 series. And, you know, Sashco is the one that bridges all of those little gaps. And they have a full spectrum of material so that whether it's a crack in a slab or a crack in a wall or a need for sealant there, you know, they have their concrete products, their roof products. It's a one-stop shopping.
Yeah. Here's my quick story from Sashco. In my previous life, before I started my custom building company about 20 years ago, I was a warranty manager for a production builder, and we used really, you know, kind of inexpensive products, whatever was available, whatever the painter wanted to pick up. And I found that when I came back to that 1-year warranty call on my houses, every house had $800 or so worth of recaulking, repainting, drywall, all that kind of stuff. And I just assumed at that stage in my life that everybody's stair stringer, everybody's crown mold, everybody's base molding was going to crack after being in the house for a year. We just kind of budgeted it in. As I started my home building company, I did a bunch of research and said, there's gotta be a better product out there. Like, if I spend another $2 more or whatever on a product, in particular Big Stretch is what I ran into, would it perform for me? Would I not have those callbacks? And you know what? Here we are almost 20 years later. I haven't used anything but Big Stretch on my houses for all of my interior painting and caulking needs. But beyond that, they also make Lexel. Talk to me about Lexel.
We use Lexel, I mean, pretty much exclusively on all of our air leakage systems. You know, mud sill, I have my little detail where we put 2 beads of it down, sandwiching the mud sill sealer, the sill sealer there, under there, and we've never had a house. I mean, when you deal with a detail like that, you have to put a material in. We don't get a second chance at it.
That's right.
Right, so we have to put something in there that we're gonna trust and believe in. And, you know, Lexel is that.
And, you know, these guys, their motto is small details lead to big performance. That fits right in with this Build Science 101 series. You know, I've heard you say, Steve, that there's miles of cracks in our houses, and that leads up to poor blower door performance, to ingress of pests and all kinds of things. Whereas if you really buy good sealants, good caulkings from Sashco, you're gonna lead to better performance in your house. So guys, big thanks to Sashco for sponsoring. You can learn more at sashco.com.
We're coming up on our last control layer on the next episode, Steve. I suspect there's a few
I might have a water management problem upon completing that one.
Because you're getting hot?
No, I'm gonna cry.
Oh,
We're almost done.
We're almost done. Next up is the thermal control layer. With that being said, we'll see you next time on the Build Show.